We're gonna get a little fancy with Rive today and make this interactive spinner. Let's get to it. So this is what we're gonna be making, and it looks deceptively simple at first, but when I hover my mouse over it, you'll see that the animation transitions. And what I want you to notice is how smoothly the transition happens. It doesn't matter where each dot is when my mouse moves over it. They will smoothly move to wherever they're supposed to be and start looping seamlessly. This is the type of thing that you just can't do with Lottie. You can't really do this with After Effects. But with Rive, you can actually not only animate this and create the interactivity, but you can ship it. You can send this right to a developer and implement this in an app or a website. If you're totally unfamiliar with Rive, there's another video on this channel. We'll link to it in the description, and maybe you should watch that one first so you can sort of get your sea legs a little bit. In this video, I'm gonna move quickly. I just kind of wanna open your mind to the possibilities of Rive, and we're gonna be using some more advanced features like constraints. So let me stop this animation and let's first talk about how to even approach something like this in Rive. You can see I've got a whole bunch of different timelines here. I've got a state machine, I've got a few layers, and that's what it takes to get something to work interactively in this smooth way. So there's some key concepts that I'm gonna throw at you, and don't worry, we're gonna have a lot more Rive training coming later on. But for now, here's some concepts in Rive that are very different than what you might be used to in After Effects. The first concept that's a little different is how timelines are used in Rive. So let me go to this timeline here. In this timeline, we have an axis, which is basically like a null object in After Effects, and I'm just rotating it 360 degrees. So this is something you'd be used to in After Effects. You use a timeline to set keyframes and animate objects. But I've got another timeline here called dots no rotate, and if we go in there, you'll see there's actually no keyframes at all. There's no animation happening. So why on earth would we have a timeline with no animation in it? Well, that's because in Rive, think of timelines not just as useful for animation, but also as ways of storing different states of your scene. You may have heard the term state machine. This is one of the coolest features in Rive, and the state machine lets you move between different states of your animation. And how do you store the information about those states? With timelines. So we need to start by thinking about what are the various states that we need. So looking at this, we've got the dots rotating around in a circle, and we've got them sort of oscillating like this. So those are two states right there. Dots are rotating, dots are oscillating. So we're gonna need some timeline or some setup to differentiate between those two things. And in order to transition between those two states, we're also going to need on and off states for each version of the animation. So for example, we've got the dots rotating here. We're also going to need a state where they're not rotating. And we're gonna need the same thing for the oscillation animation. I know you may not be tracking this quite yet. Don't worry, by the end of this video, hopefully you'll understand if I do a good job. And Rive is one of those tools, by the way, where you're gonna use it for a while and not feel quite comfortable with it. And then one day it's just gonna click and you're gonna get it. And then it's gonna be like having a superpower. So let's open up a new Rive scene and let's build this from scratch together. I'm just gonna create a basic 500 by 500 pixel artboard. If you were doing this for real, you'd want to get the exact dimensions of this thing from the product owner or the developer you're working with. So the way Rive works is you've got this big infinite canvas, and then you do all of your work inside of artboards. And so this artboard is 500 by 500 pixels. You can see that here in the properties window. And it has this kind of default gray background. We can turn that off, but for now, let's just leave it. And let's make it a little bit darker just to get a little bit more contrast with the dots we'll be creating. Now, everything with Rive starts in design mode, and then when you're ready to animate, you go to animate mode. And whatever you design in design mode, that is actually a state. That's the default state of your animation. So it's important that you know that when you're designing things. You have a lot of ways to modify things using timelines and keyframes and other tools in Rive, but it's always smart to think a little bit ahead and say, okay, what's the default state of this animation gonna be? And so if we go back to our example and go to the state machine and turn it on, you'll see the default state is these four dots just kind of rotating in a circle. So why don't we just start with that? So what I wanna do here is come up to my tools, grab an ellipse, and I'm just gonna draw it kind of right in the middle. I'm holding Option and Shift so that I can constrain it so it's a perfect circle. And it doesn't really matter how big it is and where it is because I'm gonna come over to the Properties tab immediately after. I'm gonna put it right in the middle of the frame. And then for sizing, let's just make it, I don't know, something easy, 40 by 40 pixels. There you go, there's one dot. Now I'm gonna rename this thing D1 so that we can start being organized. And I'm not gonna worry about colors just yet. And then we can just scoot this thing over to the left. We can hit Command D to duplicate it. Now we have two dots, and you can see this one is named D1, 2, which is not what I want. Come on, Rive. Let's be smarter. All right, so we've got 2 dots. I wanna make sure that the 4 dots I make are spaced equidistant from the center that they're gonna rotate around. So I need to make sure that my numbers make sense here. So why don't I just use a nice round number, 150. So we've basically moved this dot 100 pixels to the left. This one can be 350, so it's 100 pixels to the right, and then the other dots can be 100 pixels up and down. So let's just do that really quickly. I'm just gonna duplicate this again and kind of rough it into shape here. So that's in the middle, but it needs to be at 150 on Y. Duplicate it again, bring this one down a little bit, and this one needs to be 350 on Y. Cool, so now we have 4 dots spaced equidistant. Let me clean up their names really quickly. So that's D3 and D4. And now we need them to rotate around a central point. So if you think about how you would do this in After Effects, you would create a null object, you would parent these dots to that null object, and then you'd rotate that. We're gonna do something very similar in Rive. So in Rive, you have groups. And so the way that you set up a group is you select all of the layers that you want in that group, and you hit Command G. The other way you can do it is you can come up here to your toolbar, you can create a group, and then you can just drag layers underneath it. So now that these things are parented underneath the group, if I rotate the group like this, you'll see that those dots rotate for me. So many concepts that you're used to using in After Effects work very similarly in Rive. So if you already animate in After Effects, you're gonna pick up this part of Rive very quickly, probably just in a few days. It's the interactive stuff that people typically get tripped up on. And so that's what we're gonna focus on in this video. So now that we've got these 4 dots here, we need to start rotating them. Let me just rename this group really quick to rotate so that I can remember what it is when I come back to this project file later. And now we need to switch into animate mode. So you do that by coming over here and clicking this little toggle. And now we are in animate mode. And you can see down here, this is called the state machine. And we're not quite ready to dive into that yet. But there is already one timeline for us. Now remember, timelines are not just for animating. They're for storing states, okay? This is kind of a weird concept if you're coming from After Effects. It takes a little getting used to. But once you grasp it, the state machine makes a lot more sense. So remember, I said that for the rotating version of these dots, we're gonna need a state where they're rotating and a state where they're not rotating. So let's go ahead and make the rotating one. So I'm just gonna say dots rotating, just like that. And I'm gonna want this timeline to loop. So if you look right here to the left of my timeline name, you can see this arrow pointing to it. And this tells me that this timeline, if I hit play, it's just gonna play once and stop. Now there's different options in Rive. If you come here into the timeline options, I can change this from a one shot, which means it plays once and stops, to a looping timeline. You can also use ping pong, and then there's a little more advanced option down here we're gonna use in a minute. But let's just set this to loop. And then what I wanna do is put a keyframe on this rotate group. So the way you do that is you click on the group, you come over here to the properties, and this little keyframe looking icon, just click on that, and now we've got a keyframe. I can come all the way down to the end, and I can set this to rotate 1 full time. That's 360 degrees. And now if I play this, we get this rotation. Now that's happening a little fast for me, so I wanna make this timeline a little bit longer so we can slow that down. So I'm gonna click on this option here, and in duration, instead of 1 second, why don't we say 2 seconds? Let's try that. Now, an important thing to know about Rive is that it's basically gonna play back your animation as smoothly with as many frames per second as it can, but your timeline is going to have discrete frames. That's just something that you're gonna need to have in any kind of animation tool. You don't wanna have basically an infinite ability to place keyframes anywhere. You kinda want some discrete little steps to place them in. And the spacing between those steps, basically the places where you can place keyframes, that's dictated by this snap keys setting. So this is useful if, like me, you're really used to animating at 24 frames a second. And so you sort of just know in the back of your mind, like, oh, that feels like about a 12 frame move. Well, in Rive, those 12 frames may actually play back at like 120 frames per second. It's gonna be very, very smooth animation by default. You can't change that. But when I'm setting up the animation, it's gonna be easier for me to do that if I know that my timeline is operating as if I'm animating at 24 frames per second. So I'm actually gonna set it to 24, but I want you to notice it doesn't change the way it plays back. And now when I play it, it's playing back at 24 frames per second. Now, because I lengthened the timeline, but I didn't move this keyframe, it's still going too fast. So I'm gonna grab this little handle here and stretch it out so I can see the full timeline. And I'm gonna go to the very last keyframe and hit play. And let's just make sure that this loops seamlessly, which it does. Now, if I actually wanted this to animate at 24 frames per second, there's another option that's really cool here called quantize. You can turn that on, and now it actually will animate at 24 frames per second, which may not be obvious looking at the screen recording. So let me set that to like 8, and then you'll really see the difference. And this is kind of cool because you can kind of get a stop motion-y feel out of a web animation or an in-app animation, which you don't typically see, but hopefully we'll see more of. So let me turn quantize off, set this back to 24, and now we have our dots rotating state. So now we just need a state where they're not rotating. So how do we do that? The easiest way is going to be to duplicate an existing timeline. So come over here and right-click on the timeline and say duplicate. Double-click this, and let's call this dots still. And then all I need to do is just delete that last keyframe, and I can actually delete this keyframe too. So now this timeline has no keyframes on it. It is still 2 seconds long and looping, and really it doesn't matter. I could make this one frame and have it not loop. It's not gonna matter because there is no animation. The reason we're doing this is because later, now that we have these two states, we can use the state machine to blend between them smoothly. This is how you can have the dots rotate and then slowly stop moving. And then at the same time, they'll start blending into a different animation. And this is how you're gonna get that smooth transition that you wouldn't be able to do using something like Lottie. Now, before we animate the oscillating version of these dots, why don't we go into the state machine and I can show you roughly how this is gonna work having these two states. But before we do that, there's a couple of other concepts you need to be familiar with Rive. These concepts are called inputs and listeners. So what the heck is a listener? Well, let me click on the state machine, and you can see here there's a tab that says inputs and there's a tab that says listeners. So let's open up that little tab here, and you can see that there are no listeners yet. We need to add one. A listener is something in your scene on your artboard that is listening for the user to do something. And typically that means using your mouse, hovering over something, hovering off of something, or clicking something. So we need a listener that's listening for our mouse moving over the rotating dots. And so what we're gonna create for that is something called a hitbox. This is a really common concept in game design, and it's pretty simple. So even if you've never heard of this before, it's not hard to pick up. What I'm gonna do is just grab the rectangle tool, and I'm gonna draw a rectangle over the entire artboard like this. And I wanna make sure that it's actually covering up the entire artboard, okay? Now I'm doing this in animate mode. If I go back to design, you'll see that nothing is changed here, right? But here's one thing you need to keep in mind. If you have an object that exists already that you created in design mode, and then you change it in animate mode, when you go back to design mode, it's going to revert back to its original state. So just keep that in mind. So I've got this rectangle here, and I don't actually want this gray fill on it, okay? So I'm just gonna turn that off. Or I could right click on it and say delete. You just don't need it. Now this rectangle is still there, it's just invisible. And what's cool is it's on top of the dots, but because there's no fill, there's nothing actually in it pixel-wise, it's not gonna interfere, but I can now use it as a listener. So the way this works is, I'll go back into animate mode. I've got my rectangle selected, but first let's rename it hitbox, like that. With it selected, come down to listeners and add a listener. So now that hitbox is listening, but what is it listening for? What does it hear? Well, we need to set that up. So with the hitbox listener selected, I need it to listen for my mouse hovering over it, okay? So the way you're gonna do that is select the listener, come over here to the properties, and right here where it says pointer enter, this is what it's listening for. And if you click on that, you can see there's a few options: pointer enter, exit, down, up, and move. We're gonna use enter, okay? So that's the default setting. And because this hitbox is only listening for when the mouse enters, I'm actually gonna change the name of it to hitbox mouse enter. So now if I play this, the hitbox will be triggered when my mouse hovers over it. Cool, but what should it do once my mouse does that? Well, what it needs to do is set an input. So listeners listen for user interaction, and then they change inputs based on how you set it up. So let's set up the input. I'm gonna open up the inputs tab, and we're gonna set a new input. You can think of inputs sort of like variables. If you use expressions in After Effects, this concept will probably be pretty clear. But an input is almost like a control that your state machine is gonna look at to decide which timeline it should play and how it should blend between whatever is playing and what you want to play. So inputs are almost like the controls that are gonna control how your different timelines are being blended together. So let's make a new input, and there's different types of inputs in Rive. There's number, Boolean, and trigger. And what we're tracking in this example is basically, is the mouse hovered over the animation or not? It's a yes or no question. And if you can just say it out loud like that, and you're basically asking Rive a yes or no question, that is a Boolean input. That's what you want. A trigger is something that happens and happens again and happens again and happens again. So that would be more like a mouse click thing. But if it's, is the mouse over this object or not, that's yes or no, that's Boolean. So we'll select Boolean, and we're gonna name this is hovered, like this. This is kind of a naming syntax that I've picked up from software developers because it's just kind of really easy at a glance to know what this is asking. And the default state of is hovered is no. If you click this, then now it's set to yes, but I don't want to click this. I want the listener to set this automatically. So what we're gonna do is select the listener again, come over here, and remember, it's listening for the pointer enter event. So when my mouse is over this, when that happens, what should it do? Well, it's going to set an input. And now that we have an input, we can select it, and we wanna set is hovered to true. So this is already gonna start working. If I hit the space bar to activate the state machine, watch right here when I hover with my mouse. It's now on. But if I move my mouse away, well, it doesn't turn off. In Rive, as with basically any sort of development task, you have to be very, very explicit. So it doesn't automatically know to turn that off when your mouse leaves that hitbox. So we need another listener to set the input to false when I move the mouse. So I'm going to right click on this listener and duplicate it, and we'll rename the duplicate mouse leave. Now this one, I'm gonna come over and set to pointer exit. And when pointer exit happens, I want that listener to set is hovered to false. Now if I hit spacebar, you can see when I hover, is hovered gets a check mark, and when I leave, it goes away. So now we have a hitbox with two listeners on it that is correctly setting an input. Now what do we do with that input? So now we're getting to the fun stuff. So when I start this animation, I want the dots to be rotating. When I hover, I want them to stop rotating, okay? So how do we use the state machine to set that up? Well, the first thing I wanna do is I want to name this layer. So when you see a tab like this in your state machine, that means this is an animation layer. We're gonna have a few in this example, and this one is the rotation layer. So most state machine setups start with the entry node. So when you hit the space bar, Rive starts here, and then it follows this flowchart down into whatever timeline you have it going into, and these little arrows are where you set the conditions that must be true to enter that timeline. So right now, there are no conditions. So when I hit the space bar, you could see entry flash just for a brief second, and then now we're down in the dots rotating timeline, which is what we want. So the dots rotating state is being triggered automatically, but now we have the dots not rotating state, and we need that to be triggered by the mouse over event. So let's set that up. So the way you do this is you grab the state that you want to transition to, dots still, and I'm just gonna click and drag it right into my state machine. So now I have two timelines inside of here, okay? And what I want is to transition from dots rotating to this state. So I'm just gonna click right on the right side of it and drag it over like that, and that's it. Now, if I hit spacebar now, it's not gonna work correctly. Watch what happens. So it happened so fast you probably couldn't see it, but basically it went from entry into dots rotating and immediately into dots still. What I want it to do is sit here on this timeline until my mouse hovers over this. So the way you do that is by setting up a condition in this little node right here. So when you click on this, you'll see over here a conditions tab. And let me stretch this out so we have a little bit more screen real estate to work with here. So there are no conditions on this yet. So let me add one. And when you click add, now you can tell it which input it's listening for. Well, the only one we have is hovered. So let's select that. Okay. So if is hovered is true, transition to dots still. Great. Let's hit space and test this out. And it works. And notice that it actually just stops the animation mid-frame, wherever it is. It doesn't finish the animation. It doesn't reset the animation. It just stops it. And that's cool. And we can use that to make this transition really smooth. And now when the mouse leaves, I want it to go back to the rotating animation. So how do we do that? Well, we just grab the dots still timeline and we pull a noodle over to the dots rotating one. So now we've got this two-way connection, right? And this condition is set. Now we just need this condition to be set. So let's add that condition. When is hovered is false, go back to dots rotating. And let's just try this. And it works. Now, it's a little weird because it's kind of resetting the animation every time, but that's okay because keep in mind, we're eventually going to be transitioning not just from the dots rotating to not rotating, but also into a different animation entirely where they're oscillating. Now, you may notice that when I hover over this, they just stop instantly. Like it just feels a little bit stiff. So what can we do about that? Well, this is one of the things I love about Rive. So when we go from rotating to still, I'd like a little bit of a transition there. Well, if I click on this node, there's a setting over here called duration. And this is basically telling Rive how long that transition should take from this timeline to this timeline. By default, it's 0 milliseconds. But if I set this to say 250 milliseconds, so a quarter of a second, now when I hover over it, you get this little bit of a delay before it stops. Now, it's not very cool yet, but that's gonna become very useful later on when we start transitioning between other states. Are you digging this Rive stuff? If you want to learn Rive from the ground up, there's no better place to start than with our recently launched Rive Academy Volume 1 training. The course is built to teach you exactly how Rive works, so you have a strong mental model of how to build interactions in the state machine, how to layer animations in real time, and how to ship your work into actual working apps. You'll watch as we build a fully functioning set of interactions from start to finish, and you'll even get your own challenge to complete to see if you've really learned Rive. This is just the beginning of our Rive curriculum, and if you have any questions, just reach out to our support team. Companies like Notion, Figma, and Duolingo are already deep into Rive, and the opportunities for motion designers to work in interaction are heating up. So we hope to see you in class. So now we've got this very basic state machine set up. Now let's go in and do the oscillation move. So to do that, I'm gonna go back into design mode for a minute, and I'm gonna rename these layers. You'll see why. So this is dot 2. I'm gonna put an R after it, and I'm gonna put an R after the rest of these as well. The reason for that is I don't wanna use these same dots for rotating and for oscillating. You have to kind of retrain your brain a little bit when you start using Rive, because what I'm after is a visual result. How I get that result doesn't really matter. And so I don't literally need those same dots to be doing two different movements. I can have separate dots doing different movements, and then I can transition between those dots. This will make sense in a moment. So what I'm gonna do now is just duplicate these dots like this. I'm gonna move them out of the group, and these are gonna be my oscillating dots. Now I'm gonna rename them, but before I do that, I wanna move these dots into position. So let me actually lock this hitbox so I don't accidentally select it, which just happened. Then I'm gonna grab this dot, and I'm just gonna kind of roughly move it into place where I think it's gonna go, somewhere about there. And then this bottom dot, I'm gonna grab and move to there. Now the rotating dots are still visible. That's making it a little confusing, so let's turn those off. You can just click the eyeball icon and it just hides them temporarily. And so now I need to make sure that these two dots are in exactly the right spot. So this one is at 150 on X, this one is at 350, and I need these to be equidistant. I could do math, but I can also just select all four of these and come up here to the align tools. And what I'm gonna select is this option here, which is going to distribute things horizontally. And so now these are all perfectly evenly spaced, just like that. And so now what I wanna do is create a loop where these dots sort of oscillate, you know, doing some follow through. So first let's label them. This is gonna be D1 oscillate, and then we'll do D2 oscillate, D3 oscillate, and D4 oscillate. Now we can go into animate mode, and we're gonna create a new timeline. So let's just make a brand new timeline. And we're gonna call this one dots oscillate. Let's set this one to 2 seconds because we're probably gonna need the extra time. Stretch this out, and now we can animate these things oscillating. And this is gonna be pretty simple. So what I wanna do is just start with one dot. So let me select this left one here. We're only gonna be animating the Y position on these. And that's gonna make it really easy to sort of copy and paste this animation on all four of them. So why don't we start with the dot in the bottom position? So why don't we just add 100 to Y? So we'll say 350, and it goes down like that. And then I don't know how fast this needs to move. Let's just go to 1 second. And then we'll go to 150. So it goes up in the air like that. I'm gonna go to the end. I'm gonna copy and paste that first keyframe. And I'm gonna set the timeline to loop, and then we can preview this. And you can see now we're getting this oscillation. Now, this is horrible, and if you took Animation Bootcamp, you know what I'm gonna do next. I'm gonna go into the timeline. If you twirl open the options for this layer, you'll see there's the position keyframes, and there's a Y letting you know this is just Y position. And you can select these keyframes and come over here to interpolation, and you could select one of these little shortcuts over here like this cubic, interpolation. And so now if I play this, you'll see that we've got something a little bit nicer looking. But you can also click on this icon to go into a graph editor. You can get as specific as you want. I need to select all the keyframes. I can do that by clicking on this property. And then I can come over here and select this mode, cubic value, and that's going to give you Bezier handles where now you can come in here and stretch these out and really amp up the contrast between the fast and slow parts of this animation. To me, that feels a lot better. So let me go back into timeline mode, and then what I can do is click on this property, hit Command C to copy these keyframes, and then I can select these other layers and just hit paste. And now they all have identical keyframes on them. So now I just need to offset them all a little bit to get that nice follow through. So let's make this 3 seconds now. We can stretch this out to see everything. And then all I'm gonna do, let me close down this little tab. I just wanna offset these by, I don't know, maybe 2 frames a piece, just like that. And this is something that, you gotta kind of play with. And as you animate more, you're gonna get more of sort of an intuition for it. And let me zoom in and make sure that I actually made these equally spaced apart. I did. Cool. All right, so that is not enough of a stagger. I'm gonna add a few more frames here. And this is feeling a lot better to me, much more interesting. So now we need this to loop seamlessly. So this is a really cool feature of Rive, very, very, very useful. So check this out. What I wanna do is, first of all, figure out where I want this animation to actually start from. If you think about what's happening, these dots are rotating counterclockwise, and they're gonna transition to this. So I actually think that starting with the dots going down is gonna feel more natural than having them going up. So I wanna start where this dot is basically right in the middle of the frame. So I feel like probably right around there is where I actually wanna start this animation from. So I'm gonna do a couple things. First, I'm gonna come over to the timeline settings and I'm gonna turn on the work area option. And now we get these 2 little handles. These are the in and out points of your timeline. Now, the timeline itself can be longer, but when this timeline plays back, it will only play back to the in and out point. So if I hit space, it's just gonna start from there, right? But I need it to loop, and right now I've run out of keyframes. So what I need to do is to extend these keyframes all the way out much further so that we can find a good section in the middle that will loop. So first thing I wanna do is go to my duration and make this longer. Let's just double it, make it 6 seconds long, so we have plenty of time to play with here. And then we can grab these 2 sets of keyframes, copy and paste, and now we've created a loop. Let's go into the graph editor just to check our animation curves, and you can see that they've gotten a little bit screwy here. So to fix this, I'm just gonna reset all of them. Let me grab every keyframe, and let me just set them all to linear. And instead of using cubic value, I can select cubic, and I can actually just adjust them all using these controls too, which is kind of nice. Then we just need to make sure we have the correct loop point set. So if our first frame here is 129. That means we need to go forward 2 seconds to 329, and that should be our loop point. So let's set the out point to 329, hit spacebar, and now we have a seamlessly looping oscillating dots animation. So far we have 3 states. We have dots rotating, dots not rotating, dots oscillating. I think you know what we have to do now. We need a state where the dots are not oscillating. Okay, cool. So let's duplicate this timeline, right click, duplicate. And this is gonna be dots not oscillating. Inside this timeline, what we want is actually for these dots to be right in the middle of the screen. So I'm gonna just delete all of these keyframes and watch what happens. They move right back to the middle. Why did they move there? Well, remember, because in design mode, that's where we placed them. That's the initial state of these 4 dots. So let's go back to animate mode. Let's look at the state machine here. And let's move the state machine to the top. I like to keep things tidy. By the way, you can organize all of these timelines. So if you wanted to, you could make a folder and you could call this the rotating folder, and you could place your 2 rotating timelines inside of that. So now looking at the state machine, we only have 1 layer of animation setup, which is basically telling Rive what to do about the rotate or don't rotate version of these dots. Now, if I hit space, you may notice we don't see the rotation anymore. And why is that? If we go back into design mode, remember I turned off this rotate layer, and that actually sets the initial state of it to be invisible. I need them to be visible, so I'm just gonna leave the eyeball back on. And then if we go back into animate mode and I hit play, you'll see that we still get the behavior that we want for the rotating dots, but we can also see the oscillating dots and they're not oscillating. They're not oscillating because the state machine is not playing that timeline. And so what we need to do is set up a new animation layer just for the oscillating dots. It's gonna be separate from the rotation. So let's do that. We're gonna set up a new animation layer by clicking the plus next to rotation, and now we get a clean, empty state machine. This is gonna be called oscillation. And we're gonna need two timelines in it. We're gonna need the dots oscillating and the dots not oscillating. Now we're gonna use the same listener and the same input. We just want the opposite behavior. So at the beginning of the animation, we want the dots not oscillating, and then when we hover, we want them to start oscillating. So remember, every state machine starts at this entry node, and we immediately want it to go into the not oscillating timeline. Then we want it to go into the oscillating timeline only when certain conditions are met, namely, is hovered true. So when we hover, then start oscillating, and then when is hovered is false, go back to the not oscillating timeline. And if we hit spacebar, what you're gonna see is we now have these two animations that trigger and play, and they could play at the same time, but because of the way we have these state machines set up, rotation only plays when we're not hovering, oscillation only plays when we hover. So now we've got these two layers. How do we blend between them seamlessly? This is where we're gonna get into some advanced concepts and do some really fun stuff in Rive. Now, I have a quick confession to make. These gray dots that we've been animating, these are not the dots I actually want the viewer to look at.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
These aren't the droids we're looking for.
So what I'm gonna do is select each of these dots, but I'm gonna do it in design mode because I want the default state of these dots to have no fill on them. I can just click the eyeball and turn it off. I could also remove the fill. What this accomplishes visually is identical, but with Rive, whenever you're shipping stuff that's gonna go into an app or on a website, you always need to be really concerned with file size. And so if I turn the fill off, from what I understand, the information about the fill is still in the Rive file. It's gonna make that Rive file just a little bit bigger. I know I don't need the fill, so I could just delete it and make my Rive file a little bit smaller, so that's probably what I should do. So I can just right-click on the properties icon for the fill and delete it. And then I can do the same thing with these dots inside of the rotate group. So let me come over here and delete that. Great, so what have we just done? If we go back into animate mode and I go into, say, my dots rotating timeline and I play it, you can't see anything, right? If I select those dots and I sort of scrub through the timeline, you can see they are still rotating, but they're just invisible. Now, why on earth would we want to do this? All right, so this is a little hard to explain, but try to follow me. Just stick with me for a minute. I want the dots to be rotating, and when I hover, wherever they are in that animation, if the user does it at the beginning, in the middle, at the end, it doesn't matter, I want the dots to seamlessly move to where they should be and start oscillating at the same time. And if you think about how you would try to accomplish something like that using Lottie or After Effects, you can't, because the user could hover at any point in the animation, and that animation needs to not just stop and now play a new one, it needs to transition between those two. So what I actually need is this setup. I need 4 other dots that are going to essentially be parented to or follow these rotating dots. At the same time, we've got this oscillation animation that's happening. If I open up that timeline and scrub, you can see that. And I need those dots when I hover to now transition and start tracking these dots. So it's almost like in After Effects, imagine you have 2 sets of nulls animating and you're parenting a layer to this null, but then you're almost transitioning its parent to someone else over time. And you can do this in Rive using a cool feature called constraints. So to demonstrate how constraints work, the first thing I'm gonna do is go into design mode, and I need to have the actual colored dots that I wanna use. I'm just gonna copy those from the project that I already built here. So I've got my yellow, red, green, blue dot. I'm just gonna copy them and bring them over like this and paste them. Great, so now we've got these 4 dots, and these are actually what are gonna be turned on and visible to the viewer. Now, our layer browser over here, it's getting a little bit hard at a glance to tell which layer is which, and so I'm gonna use a cool feature called tags. I'm gonna select these 4 layers and right-click them and create a new tag. And now you can see they all have this tag on there. If I then click off of this and I don't have anything selected, over here, the tags property browser pops up and I can label these. So I'm just gonna label these visible. And now I can very quickly see which dots are visible and which ones aren't. This is just an organization tool, but as your Rive projects get more advanced and more complicated, it's really a useful way of organizing things. So in a nutshell, what I want to happen is, let's start with this yellow dot. And I can actually just turn the other ones off for now. I can just go into design mode and just hide all of these, okay? Why don't we just work on one dot and make this a little bit simpler? So this yellow dot, at first, what I want is I want it to basically be parented to one of these rotating dots, dot 1, okay? And then when I hover, I want it to be parented to one of the oscillating dots, dot 1. So just to hammer this home, it's parented to one dot, and then it's parented to another, and we transition smoothly between those two. So the way you do that in Rive is with constraints like I mentioned. So with the yellow dot selected, let me go back into design mode just so that this constraint is always active. This is the default state, okay? So come over here, and there's a constraints option that you can turn on by adding a constraint. And what we're gonna add is a transform constraint. A transform constraint is basically just like parenting in After Effects. Think of it that way. Now that I've added this constraint, I can click on the options for it. And the first thing you need to tell it is what's the target. This is what layer, what object am I actually parented to? So you can click on this icon, and now Rive will give you this big blue indicator that now you're about to select the parent for this thing. And I want it to initially be parented to this dot here. So let me click that and watch what happens. It moved over. So this is really cool because if I go into the animate mode and I play the dots rotating timeline, now look at that. The yellow dot is rotating. Pretty slick. But at some point, I'm gonna want it to be parented to a different dot. And I'm also gonna wanna be able to keyframe how that happens. So what do we need? We need another constraint. So first, let me rename this constraint to rotating so I know which one's which. And then I'm gonna add a new constraint, transform. And in the settings for that, I'm gonna pick a different target. I'm gonna pick the oscillating dot. So let me select that. Now I've got two constraints on this, and this is the oscillating constraint. Now, if I go into animate mode and I play this rotating timeline, you'll see that it no longer rotates. If I play the oscillating timeline, it does rotate. Now, why did it stop rotating and start oscillating? Well, it's because of the order I have these constraints in. If I go back into design mode and look at this, I've got rotating first, I've got oscillating second. But if I click on the options for oscillating, you'll see that there's a strength parameter here, and it's set to 100%. Now, the rotating strength is also 100%, but it's being overruled because oscillating comes after it. But if I set rotating to 50 and I set oscillating to 50, now it's actually blending between both of those. And it's probably gonna give us some really weird effect here, where when I play the oscillating timeline, you can see it doesn't quite work right. And when I play the rotating timeline, it doesn't quite work right either. It's kind of blending the two movements of the parents together. So this is the trick we're gonna use to blend between our two animations. So let's go back to design mode and select the yellow dot, and let's set up the defaults for this. So by default, rotating should be at 100. It should be following the rotation animation. Oscillating should be at 0. It shouldn't be oscillating, right? But when I hover, what I'd like is for the oscillating strength to increase to 100, and I'd like the rotating strength to decrease to 0. So how do we set that up? Well, that's another animation layer. We've got dots rotating and not rotating. That's one layer. We've got dots oscillating and not oscillating. That's one layer. And now we've got basically which of these constraints should we be listening to? That's another layer. So let's go into animate mode. Let's go into the state machine and let's add another layer. And why don't we call this constraints? Now we're gonna need a timeline for this. So let's make a new timeline. And let's call this constraint rotation so that we know this is gonna be the timeline that stores the constraint setup for when this dot should be rotating. And you wanna know something funny? We don't actually need to do anything with this timeline. If you have a timeline with no keyframes, no properties, nothing, it's basically just telling Rive, use the defaults. That's it. And if you have another layer that's referencing some element in your Rive animation, it will override anything on another layer that doesn't have a keyframe set. This is one of those things you gotta kind of just use Rive a little bit and that will make more sense, but just watch what I'm about to do. So let's be organized. Let's make a constraints folder and we'll move this timeline into it. It doesn't matter really how long this timeline is or if it's looping or not because there's no keyframes, there's no animation in this. Then we're gonna right click, duplicate, and we're gonna call this constraint oscillate. And this is going to be the timeline that holds the state where my constraints are set up so that it follows the oscillating animation. So to do that, I can come in here to rotating, and if I set the strength to 0, watch what happens. In the timeline, Rive sets a keyframe with that value in it, right? So now the strength of that rotating constraint is 0. If I go to oscillating and set this to 100, there you go. So now we have the two states of these constraints saved in these two timelines, okay? And now what we can do is go into the state machine, which I'll move up to the top here. And now in our constraints layer, let's drag both of these into the state machine, and let's set up our conditions. So upon entry, we're going first to the rotation constraint setup, okay? And let's just hit play and see what happens. Okay, cool. So now that yellow dot is rotating correctly. When we mouse over, that is when I want it to go into oscillate mode. So we can drag a noodle to it, select this little conditions node here, and let's add that condition. When is hovered is true, go to oscillate. Let's see what happens. Ah, look at that. It works, but it happens instantly. It's not pleasing to the eye. It's not cool. So how do we make it cool?
To look cool and to be cool.
Well, basically what we want to do is have the strength not just be set to 0 and not just instantly set to 100. We want it to transition from 100 to 0 and from 0 to 100. And we probably want some interesting animation curve to blend them and make them feel good. Here's the thing, we don't actually need keyframes to do that in Rive. What we can do is just go to the state machine, and on this little condition node here, which is also like a transition node, you've got an interpolation setting down here. And what you can do is set up an animation curve for it. Also, if you remember, we've got this duration setting. So I don't want that transition to happen instantly. Why don't we say, take half a second, 500 milliseconds, and don't happen linearly, happen with more of an easing in and out curve like this. And now, watch what happens when I hover. You see how it transitioned to the oscillating animation. I'll reset the animation and do it again. And so you can see, no matter where that dot is when I hover, it moves to the correct position and then starts animating. Do you see? I hope you understand what we just did. We did two animations that were basically just there for reference for this yellow dot to now choose. Am I following this layer or this layer? And you can smoothly blend between them to create really complex behaviors. So now we can set up the opposite behavior. We're going to drag a noodle from oscillate back up to rotation. And in that node, we need to set the duration to half a second so it matches. We need to set the condition is hovered is false. That's when we go back to rotation mode. And the interpolation we can set to be something a little more interesting like that. And now when we play this, we should get the behavior we're expecting, and we're not though. What is going on?
What is happening?
So I left this mistake in to show you an example of something that happens to me all the time when I'm using Rive, which is you kind of forget that you sometimes have to set keyframes on things that are already kind of the default, because if you're blending between two timelines and you don't have keyframes on the properties that you want to blend, there's nothing for Rive to blend between. Let me show you what I mean. So the problem is going to be in this timeline, constraint rotation. You can just double click on it to go right into it. So notice I have no keyframes there. I thought this would be fine because the default constraint setup is what I want. However, I am going to need to put keyframes on there anyway. So what I can do is go down to constraints, click on rotating, and just add a keyframe here. Go to oscillating and add a keyframe. And so now there's something for Rive to actually blend between as it transitions back and forth. Now this should work correctly, and lo and behold, it does. So now we have one dot set up, and all we have to do is apply the exact same setup to the three other dots. I'll do one more with you, and then I'll do the other two really quickly. So we'll go back into design mode, and this time let's select the red dot and let's make it visible. And let's make sure we know which of these dots we're going to parent it to, right? So that's going to be dot 3, and it's also going to be dot 3 on the oscillating version, okay? So I just need to set up two constraints. Transform. This one is going to be rotation, and this one is going to be for oscillating. I need to set up the targets. So let's set the target for rotation to be dot 3 in the rotating group. And then the oscillating target is going to be dot 3 in the oscillating group. And by default, I want the rotation set to 100, and I want the oscillating strength set to 0. We can pop into animate mode, and now we just need to change the constraint rotation timeline, select the red dot, come over here to the constraints and add a keyframe on each of the strengths, so there's something to transition between. Then we go into the oscillate timeline, and we just reverse these. So now this is 0%, and this is 100%. We can go to the state machine, and we can play this, and you can see that now you're getting the correct behavior. And these things move seamlessly between the two animations, and it doesn't matter where you hover. It's really, really cool. Now, you probably are seeing some weird behavior when my mouse leaves where things jump around. Don't worry, we'll fix all that. I'm gonna quickly do the other two dots and get them set up so that we can now polish this. All right, so all of the constraints are set up. Let's preview this. When I hover over it, the dots transition seamlessly into the oscillating animation, and when I move my mouse, they go back seamlessly. Look at this. How cool is this? All right, so there's little things that I like to polish. So for example, there seems to be like a little hitch when the mouse leaves. So when the mouse leaves, is hovered becomes false, and we go from the oscillate state back into the rotation state. And the way we transition is dictated by the settings on this node here. So that duration, maybe that's too long. So let's just try shortening that. And we can also play around with the interpolation. One of the cool things about Rive, let me go ahead and scale this down, by the way. A handy hotkey is to hit F, and it will fit your selected artboard to whatever size of your canvas is showing. And so now I can hit space to play this, and as it's playing, I can kind of mess around with it, but then I can also play around with different interpolations. I feel like I want it to be a little bit more instantaneous, the transition back into the rotation mode. So I'm just bending this Bezier handle up a little bit. So now let's see if that feels any better. And to me, that does. It's a little bit more of a sudden transition back. And this is really fun to play with. If you watch, if the yellow dot is on the left side, it works. If it's on the top, if it's on the right side, like that, and if it's on the bottom, all of this works seamlessly. That actually works really well. And what's even cooler is I could now just export this, put this on a website, put this in an app, and have it work perfectly. So that's it, we did it. Let me know in the comments how successful I was. It was really to just open your mind to the possibilities that Rive gives you that do not exist in any other application animators can use. This is a very simple example of what you can do, but you can use this concept of blending timelines and constraining layers to alternate versions of animations to do crazy things. You can easily transition between walk and run cycles and do all kinds of neat tricks using these principles. And I really encourage you to try out Rive. There's a free version, and just mess around. Try following along with this tutorial and see if it opens up your mind a little bit to the possibilities. Did you like this? Was this useful? Please let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe, all the things YouTubers are supposed to say. I appreciate your time, and I'll see you next time.